Hey there, listeners of Some Substance. This is Nick, and you're listening to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Is that tacky? Listeners of Some Substance? Certainly a mouthful. Fuck it, let's keep it. Today I'm chatting with Michael Berdan from the New York City noise rock / industrial metal band Uniform about Hubert Selby Jr.'s The Room. We talk about the importance of tone and aesthetic in both vocal delivery and fiction's prose, about Berdan's deeply personal connection to Selby Jr.'s writing, and perhaps most importantly, about how art can be coarse while still delivering a message of hope and compassion. But before we get into the discussion, here's a taste of Uniform performing Delco, the lead track off of their latest record, Shame. Yes, I just have to say that I'm super pumped to talk about Selby Jr. because I've been kind of maybe not nefariously, but I've sliding this out as an option to people hey, do you want to talk about this? I know this book isn't for anyone, but I really want to talk about Hubert Selby Jr. and nobody's really bitten on that yet. And so I just love the fact that we kind of connected over talking about this book. So just to start, I very much appreciate that.
Man, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it. I've mentioned Hubert Selby as an influence kind of throughout Uniform Records. And oddly enough, this is the first time that I consciously didn't mention him as a direct influence to the record, even though he very much is. But it seems just given his subject matter and kind of his visceral nature, that it's a bit off-putting. And, there was a lot of other things that I was reading as we were making the new record. It's pulling from a lot of Raymond Chandler and whatnot. But I would much rather talk about, a man in a literal and figurative prison and what he's his delusions of grandeur and abject hopelessness than talking about Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe. Not that those people aren't also consumed with delusions of grandeur and abject hopelessness. They are, but anyway, I'm very grateful to get the chance to talk about this. Thank you. Excellent.
So maybe before we get into talking about The Room, I'm curious, since there are a lot of those literary references and allusions in Uniform Records, what's kind of your bag in terms of books and reading and literature, and how'd you get into that?
It's always been a prevalent force in my life. When I was a little kid, I loved it when my parents or babysitters or whatever read to me, and I grew up in the 1980s. And reading Rainbow was very much a thing when I was a little kid.
Classic.
And that's something that spoke to me a great deal. I love television. Who the fuck doesn't love television? Liars. That's who doesn't love television. But I don't actually mean that everybody who doesn't like TV is lying, but you know what I mean. I rather than having a story visually spelled out to me through TV, I loved being able to elaborate on visuals in my mind, and go into different places. And so, reading Rainbow was this bridge between my imagination and the actual TV, which is fucking great. And, I remember being a little kid and, my, seeing where the wild things are and that being very, very important to me. And, your usual, Dr. Seuss, Shel Silverstein and whatnot. And then I get a little older and, I think like a lot of people, especially young boys, I got into Tolkien, kind of via The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings movies. And, that was a real game changer for me. And along the same time, came the age of elementary school book reports with Call the Wild, Once and Future King, and all of that, and To Kill a Mockingbird. And I loved all of that. Then I remember 1990, the second film adaptation of Lord of the Flies came out, and that made me hunt down Golding. And that's something that book and him in general, stuff that I still kind of revisit semi-regularly to this day. I like a lot of other people, again, I like Stephen King, and I liked Stephen King when I was a little kid. I like Stephen King now, and I think it's pretty remarkable. It kind of speaks to his ability that a 12-year-old and a 40-year-old can both kind of glom on to these stories and understand what's going on. That I'm very into plainly spoken literature, and there's a place for the highbrow, and I'm not gonna say that I'm not one of those people who occasionally pretends to read Ulysses, because I definitely do. But at the same time, I love simple stories, and he's always been a big part of that to me. And as a little kid, or middle school, or maybe not so much a little kid, I became kind of through Stephen King and also via horror movies and my local video stores. I would go through the library, and I would go through, sorry, I've got a barking dog in the background. I'm so sorry. Give me 1 second. So, going through video stores and my local library and my local bookstores, looking at Stephen King titles, that kind of brought me to a lot of other contemporary horror authors, and kind of going through horror book adaptations, the Richard Matheson's, Legend of Hell House and all of that, or Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist. And, with that also comes Hellraiser and Clive Barker. And that was my backdoor to the 90s splatterpunk movement and kind of the proto splatterpunks. I was very into Jack Ketchum for a long time, and I still am. I think he was a tremendous, a brutal but fascinating and ultimately compassionate writer. Richard Lehman, which I thought was shit then, and I think is shit now. And Poppy Z. Bright, kind of all that stuff. And that kind of got me through high school. Then, at the end of high school, I barely graduated high school. I'm a community college dropout. And kind of with that came a lot of insecurities. And, it's stuff that I still kind of carry to this day. But I remember really, really having a chip on my shoulder and wanting to show people that I was worthwhile, worthy, and smart. And, I started, reading kind of basic existentialist stuff, reading your Camus and your Sartre and all of that. And, that spoke to me a a whole lot. I might have kind of gotten into it via pretension, but it's stuff that really wound up mattering to me, and the more literary moments of those authors, like, for instance, like Camus, like The Fall, and obviously The Stranger, really stayed with me. In Catholic high school, you're not gonna read much philosophy. At least I didn't. You'll be made aware of like Thomas Aquinas and maybe some Jesuit stuff. Like I knew who Kierkegaard was, but we didn't read Kierkegaard. But anyway, that led me to the nihilists. I got very into Schopenhauer for a while, and like Nietzsche, obviously, and then a lot of kind of like futurist and like deconstructionist stuff. I was very into Derrida for a bit. I have my moments with Baudrillard, and then obviously comes like I shouldn't say obviously, but comes like the Situationists and Society of the Spectacle and all of that, and after a while, I kind of hit a wall there, and it kind of led me screaming to Philip K. Dick. And I think I had a good few years where I only read Philip K. Dick, and there are worse things. And getting out of that, somewhat in tandem with that, I got very into the latter beats or the post beats. I was very into to Ballard. I was very into Burroughs, and that stuff that stayed with me and brought me into it's a lot of kind of what got me into industrial music in a lot of ways, and then from then I get into more kind of contemporary transgressive writers, such as like Dennis Cooper, Peter Sotos, like Matthew Stocco, and all those those edgy fools that we're not really supposed to talk about, but but meant a lot to me, and still do mean a lot to me. I think I think that Dennis Cooper and Peter Sotos are two of the greatest living American writers, and and Pete Sotos is actually has become a friend of mine, and that and that kind of writing that led me to kind of hunt down the music that a lot of these people were making, and that led me to power electronics. And at a similar time, I was getting into, probably via Burroughs as well, and via the, what's it called? Via Burroughs and via like cinema, like Requiem for a Dream and whatnot, that got me into contemporary, drug type authors, which brings me to, Hubert Selby and like Jerry Stahl, and, Nick Tosh's, and that's been very, important to me, kind of, I'd say like age 20 onward. And I think that that's like kind of my main like literary romance would be with like this corner of like kind of post-beat, drug and crime oriented literature. But like with the addict in mind, I like people who write from a place of relation and empathy, and I think that these people do a remarkable job. As far as stuff that I'm reading right now, I've been kind of on this big like Ryu Murakami kick for kind of since lockdown. I don't know. I just kind of feel like putting myself through some shit. So there we go. So that's, I think, where I am in a literary sense at this moment and kind of through my life.
Yeah. So you've kind of painted this big arc that really has a lot of that kind of like tonal similarities, whether you're going from like the early horror stuff into like your classic, I'm early 20s, I'm reading my existential lit, into some of that like later transgressive stuff. But basically, like one of the common things is really kind of playing around with what that tone is. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of wonder from like the standpoint of, music and lyrics, especially like in a quote unquote aggressive music setting, a lot of times the tone of it is somewhat emphasized more so, at least to the first listen, than the actual lyrical content. And I feel like a lot of that has a parallel in, literature as well. Like sometimes when we're talking about, like Burroughs and even a lot of Selby Jr., like it's difficult to like pick up on the actual writing content, the actual sentences, what they're saying, but a lot of it is based on rhythm and sort of what the aesthetic is and what the tone is that they want to put onto the reader. And so like how do you deal with that yourself when you're writing lyrics and when you're trying to play with that from the uniform standpoint?
Yeah, I relate to that a lot. To me personally, there isn't much of a difference in intent when it comes to art across the board. I get as much out of books and cinema as I do out of music, if not more. And a lot of that just has to do, with aesthetics and with like setting a feeling. And that feeling is kind of based around my personal, emotional, and psychological and spiritual landscape, and it's like I like horror movies and horror novels because I deal with a lot of fear, and I'm someone who's been afraid his whole life of whatever may be like looming overhead or over my shoulder. And when it comes to writing lyrics, I've always been pulling from books and from cinema. And when I, back in the day, I would kind of just have a line in mind and I'd yell out this line in a song, and then I would kind of base just like regular, like sounds around it. I wasn't actually like writing lyrics. I was kind of just like primal screaming around this, like this one line and saying that there were words. And then, I'd say within like the past 10 years or so, I really started paying attention to writing lyrics. And, I wanted it to, for the longest time, they were like journal entries almost. I was comfortable enough with letting people know what our aesthetic was. Obviously, like you kind of can't hide an aesthetic identity, but I was so scared of being being misinterpreted that I people thinking that I was maybe like glorifying depravity, and that was never my intention. And so I kept my lyrics pretty close to my vest and would let people kind of know the topics that I was referencing, and but then have that be that. And that's something that's changed a great deal just within the past year or so, to the point that now I find that writing lyrics, I want it to, obviously it's a solitary activity, but I want to do it with a greater connection to the world in mind. For me, my opinion of art, it's kind of an ever evolving thing. And I understand, some people needing to make their art just for themselves in order to stay sane. I've definitely been there at points, but right now I want for the things that I write to be a connection with another person or another group of people. And I get a lot of that through the authors that I admire. These were people who were very much talking about their lives and their experiences, and bringing themselves to places of like great discomfort and, humiliation, in a lot of ways, just like in order to emote and I think in order to relate to others. And so I've decided to do that, and it doesn't mean that I haven't changed my subject matter at all. You hear a lot these days from people in in more kind of like transgressive button pushy circles about like forcing yourself to self-censor or being censored, and like there's this like large swath of like blue-haired pre and post grads with pitchforks out to get you, and like if you say dirty words, and I've come to believe that that's total bullshit. All that like is, I think the climate today, what it really is asking is for you to provide context. And, the writers that I truly like, do contextualize their work. You know a bit about their lives, a bit about the background of these stories. And, these stories are written with like such a pronounced empathy that like, they can be vile, but like, that like their intention isn't, it might be to elicit an emotion, and that emotion might even be shock, but it's not shock alone. It's shock just to kind of emphasize like how like just what hurt, like the depths of hurt, and like what the depths of hurt might look like and feel like. It's far from a glorification, as instead it's very much just a cry for understanding, or I think it's trying to speak to those who may be there themselves.
Yeah. And that's a perfect lead in into, talking about Selby Jr.'s The Room, that topic of not wanting to be misunderstood, but also using these somewhat harsh things actually as a mechanism for connection, which may sound counterintuitive, but it's very much there. But perhaps a brief summary for the listener, if you haven't read The Room. It's basically kind of a largely plotless novel about a man who it's not really apparent what he's been arrested for, but it sort of implies that he's kind of a small-time crook, and he's basically isolated in a room that's 9 feet by 6 feet, and pretty much the only real-time plot happens is that he cycles through his daily nothingness. But the novel weaves in these sort of fantasies and daydreams and delusions mixed with some of his memories, and these delusions kind of get increasingly harsh and sadistic as he's kind of identifying these scenarios in which he wants to get back at the people who have wronged him. And they get very, very difficult to read. I mean, just to be upfront, there's lots of violence, there's lots of torture, there's things in there that are harsh to read on the page. But what it really seems like it is it's a testament to not leaving anyone behind, to what really happens in isolation, to how hard this whole life thing can be. And, we really have to kind of look out for that connection to each other, because if you break that connection, if you sever that sort of pathway into functioning in society, this is sort of what you're left with. It's almost kind of a cautionary tale in a way. So with that large arc in mind, and how tricky it is to read, but at the same time how much he uses it as a force to emote, I'm just curious, what's the thing that you directly connect with in this book?
God, it's a book that has been pivotal in my life in a number of ways at different times over the years. And to me, what really counts is like contextualizing Hubert Selby's life when this book was written. He wrote it. It's his second novel. He wrote it after the success of Last Exit to Brooklyn. And, the guy had this like fucking crazy life. He joined the Merchant Marines when he was like a kid. And he gets tuberculosis, and like in the TB ward, he gets, becomes hooked on drugs, and he has these like, this very intense near-death experience that, that he talks about a lot in interviews where, he says like, I realized I was going to die, and that when I died, my life would be meaningless. And that realization, that epiphany, is what drove him to write in the end, and to dedicate his life to writing. He's like, well, I don't know what else to do, but I guess I can write. And that led about, that birthed the series of short stories that wound up being Last Exit to Brooklyn. Like, if you've ever read Last Exit to Brooklyn, it very much reads like a novel. It's weaved like a novel. There's all of these characters that kind of go in and out of these stories. But it started out as a series of short stories, and Last Exit to Brooklyn, it eventually wound up being a hit, and he came into a tremendous amount of money, and he moved to Los Angeles from Brooklyn, and his addictions, all but destroyed him, and he put all of that money into his arms and down his throat, and he wrote, it broke him, and he wrote The Room during his first year of sobriety. And, I'm going to speak from personal experience here, and, I'm kind of public about it, in interviews and such, although I don't like to make it a focal point of my persona, but it's an important part of my life. Is, I've been clean and sober for, the past 10 years or so. And, I remember that first year of sobriety, I might have outwardly, kind of acted like it was roses and kittens and boy, I'm so happy to be alive. But inwardly, I was going through fucking hell. It was the most terrifying and just spiritually and psychologically anguished period of my life. All of my feelings that I'd been numbing for decades, with drugs and alcohol, everything I'd been running from just came right back in this giant wave, and I had no buffer. It was just unmitigated, fucking, mainlined feelings, and that was horrible. And, in my head, I was constructing these elaborate stories about how everyone was out to get me, and how, how the decks stacked against me, but, at the same time, how I was going to prove to everyone that I was, special or brilliant, and all these people who who I felt had let me down, and who I just hated, they were going to feel really sorry, and they were going to, maybe be humiliated because of my success in a roundabout way, and just all of this bullshit, just playing out in my head, And, with this, came this, I just felt so profoundly alone. I couldn't escape my own mind. And I remember reading The Room for the first time, maybe when I was 20. I read it right after Last Exit to Brooklyn. And I read it at a time in my life where I was, just kind of consumed with anger and resentment. And I viewed it at the time in such a way as just kind of this catalog of horrors. And at one point it was about kind of the futility of hope, and another part it was a revenge fantasy. And I really kind of got off on that when I was 20, and thinking that Jim Goad's Answer Me was the Bible. And that's not who I am at 40, and that wasn't who I was at 30 when I got clean. Reading it at 30 and then rereading it again recently when we started talking about doing this episode, I'm overcome with identification and relation, and it takes me right back to this the terror in my mind during that first year, the first kind of couple of years of sobriety. And with that, the feelings of kind of impotent rage and resentment without hope. But then this kind of in the back of my head, just wondering, am I ever going to feel different from this hell that I'm feeling right now? That's how I felt reading it 10 years ago. And reading it now, I'm reading it as someone who has led a life after early sobriety, and after being clean for a bit, and having kind of seen the other side of this abject hopelessness and this resentment. And I read it with a tremendous amount of just so much empathy. And I know from the stories and from Hubert Selby Jr.'s other work, I sometimes I feel weird calling him Hubert Selby Jr. and not calling him Cubby, because if you ever read an interview with him, or see an interview or see the documentary, It'll Be Better Tomorrow, he's almost insistent on being called Cubby, and there's something just so beautiful about how a lot of this harsh stuff penned on a page came from a guy who through his entire life went by his childhood nickname of Cubby. Oh, it's just fantastic. I think it's the best. And some might think it goes to show the duality of the person, but I don't think that there's really any duality involved here. I think that what he was dealing with was this absence of filter, where it's all intention, and he's very plainly and very honestly speaking to his feelings at the moment. And when he wrote The Room, he was feeling totally helpless and just consumed by paranoid resentment and delusions, and just lost. And I know what it feels to feel that lost. And just judging by his later work, The Demon and and Requiem, and the stories in Song of Silent Snow, he's very much speaking to these characters that live on the margins. And I feel in a very real spiritual and psychological, emotional sense, he never left the margins. And so he spoke to what he knew and how he identified. And I think that he was hoping that people would read it and and see themselves and feel less alone. I think I think that's so beautiful, because life is horrifying and sad and gross, and there's things in the room that like rival Desaad in a lot of ways. Like there's like 120 days of Sodom type stuff in there if you want to take it at that kind of at that face value. But where Desaad was, he might have like been couching his shit in like, something more highbrow, but like, it's just, the word sadism is based on his name. And like, I truly believe that, like, given his life, that, he didn't mean anything from his writings other than cruelty. And his intention there was, Desaad's intention's cruelty, where someone like Hubert Selby, his intention was compassion and relation, and maybe identifying with like the existence of like resentment and cruelty, but as a means of like stepping away from them and escaping them. I just think it's so stunning. I think it's so wonderful.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm still kind of cycling on that concept of things being so harsh, but at the same time, it really is something meant for connection. And if you even crack open the book, and the epigraph is, "This book is dedicated with love to the thousands who remain nameless and know." And even that like last two words of that is so impactful, because it's that, yes, we know that there will be thousands that remain nameless, but also that knowledge that you yourself are nameless, that you are isolated, that you are sort of cut off from society. I think that's a very powerful thing that a lot of us are actually sort of tangentially feeling now through, the COVID setup. We're all kind of having to endure these small bubbles and lack of socialization and all that kind of thing. But also just, it's really impressive to me that tone mixture up front can be that coarse nature, but it really is, it's about that empathy, that beauty, that compassion. And I think about that with respect to, we were talking about before, where like tone matters in lyrics and how you deliver things and aesthetics. And then I kind of connect it back to, the actual prose stylings and specific ways that Selby Jr. penned sentences. Because you mentioned it's kind of beat-ish or post-beat. And he drops his apostrophes, he puts slashes in weird spots. He loved putting caps down. A lot of times you get this weird flow of text on the page, because when he finished a paragraph, his goal was to remove barriers to typing, to getting the words down. He felt that it was not the job of the author to be in between the characters in the story. And so you get these weird things where like he finishes a paragraph, he just drops straight down. So the indents are all asymmetrical and stuff like that. And so like those combinations of things, I feel like from a form standpoint, a lot of times on this podcast, we ask ourselves did the form come first or the story come first? Did the story generate the necessity for the form, or did somebody just come up with a structure that they wanted to populate? And I kind of feel, like Kerouac, a little over Kerouac at this point. It's sort of a long list of things that he ate and drank in a row.
Yeah.
And stylistically like embellished, I guess. That's kind of where I arrived at. Not that, Dharma bums I can roll with, okay. But it feels a little hollow to me. And I think I want to draw like the distinction with Selby Jr. that you might look at this and say, oh, look, he's got that, like the sort of vernacular spelling. He's got some of these same moves, but I never once get the impression that he was doing it to be showy. I got the impression that that's just how he wanted to spit it out, and so that's how he did it. And I think that's like a really powerful thing too, in terms of like the creation of art itself. And I again, it's hard to, I almost feel like a little protective of this book, because there's pages on here that are really rough to read.
Yeah.
Give you physical feelings, and like I was actually grinding my teeth for the first time that I can remember in recent years reading a book. But if you mix that in with those messages of compassion and from like the prose and stylistic stuff, it is a combination that I think really doesn't exist in too many other authors. And like, how fucking cool is that?
Yeah, man, totally. And like, I completely agree with you. Reading this, every time elicits like a physical response from me, like it gives me chills. It makes me upset. And yeah, a lot of that's from the content, but a lot of it has to do with the style and the vernacular. And, he's far from the first person to, play with like, linguistic form or to like, or to try to write the way that people speak, like, I look at like James Joyce or like, or Beckett's form, where that could get flashy. I think that Selby is very much just, he's writing what is exactly in his head, exactly how he hears it, which sometimes is disjointed, which will lead for like paragraph breaks, which sometimes is all giant fucking capital letters, for pages upon pages, which will lead to, a number of non sequiturs and like, comes off like almost like stream of consciousness at points. And I'm sure that sometimes it was. His writing seems to me to be very much utilitarian. And like, I think about like what Cormac McCarthy said about like, writing, without certain punctuation and, the need that like, if you're going to do it, like your story needs to be, all that much better. It needs to be good in order for people to be able to follow it, because otherwise they'll get lost. And, I think with McCarthy, he's speaking about, his style, and he's speaking to, his and Faulkner's abilities. But with Selby, it's, I think, kind of the opposite of that. Like there's nothing about flashiness. Like, he uses these slashes for apostrophes when he uses apostrophes. And the only reason that he did that was because on his typewriter, the apostrophe didn't work. So he used this slash, Everything that he does, I think, is utilitarian. And I think that his stories themselves are utilitarian, like he's talking about in the room. He's very literally talking about someone who's locked away. And, the analogy, and the subtext about like, somebody being locked away in their own mind is like very, very apparent. In Last Exit to Brooklyn, he's very much talking to his experiences growing up in South Brooklyn, at a certain period of time, Requiem for a Dream, like he's again talking about like what he knows. He's very literally talking about like junkies and what it feels like to be a junkie. Something like The Demon, the book that came after The Room, is, kind of like a barely couched metaphor for recovery. The book is dedicated to Bill Wilson, who's the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous and the author of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, the big book. And I'm reciting this from memory the best I can, so I might be wrong, but I think the dedication is to Bill W., who taught me that I needed to give up in order to win. And The Demon is about, it's this guy who starts off with like committing minor transgressions towards society, be it like, stealing or like, infidelity, sleeping around. And it eventually builds up to like apocalyptic violence. And, that's, I think that speaks a lot to how a lot of addictions wind up playing out. And so, yeah, he's just talking about what he knows, and what he knows is like kind of the everyman pain, he's speaking to universal truths, and he's trying to use like the vernacular of someone who he's trying to write out the way, he's trying to write out phonetically. And that might come off as showy from time to time. And not to repeat myself too much and be too tangential, but, he's his style is all based on someone trying to talk to someone else. And you're the person reading it is the person who is being conversed with.
Yeah, and you hit on that everyman pain, and I wanted to read a section that I feel like encapsulates this perfectly, which is basically really close to the end of the book. It's kind of where it ends up, where after going through all of these fantasies and delusions, you basically get a small snapshot of what actually happens in the trial. A lot of his revenge fantasies are all about sort of performing perfectly in this trial to defend himself, and then you get this small snapshot where it shows that he tried and they basically just kind of swept him under the rug because he's not a lawyer. He doesn't have the skill set, and they just sort of pushed him aside. And so he ends up kind of having a full moment of breakdown. And there's this paragraph that I really identified with from that everyman pain concept. And it goes, "And anyway, what's the use? Everything will fall apart eventually anyway. Everything always ends up nothing eventually. I can't win. I just can't seem to win. There just doesn't seem to be any point to anything. It will end up being wrong anyway. Everything I do is wrong. Even if I'm right, I'm wrong. Been wrong so long, I guess I wouldn't even know if I was right. It's not important anyway. I've been wrong long enough to last me the rest of my life anyway." And that sentence in there, that everything always ends up nothing, is kind of repeated a little bit through the book, but just that's such a powerful combination of that everyman vernacular mixed with kind of something so universal and poetic. And so I get a little bit of chills just reading that paragraph, partially due to the whole arc of the novel itself. Mm-hmm. But his ability to speak that direct sort of truth is just frankly impressive. It's kind of unmatched in that sweet spot between, like you said, in the transgressive literature world, mixed with some stylistic stuff, mixed with some quote unquote highbrow literature. He's kind of threading the needle between a lot of this. And at the end of the day, I just love it.
Yeah, I completely agree. He's someone who, if you talk to people who understand them, they it's not that he's not easy to understand. His, you read these books and you can pretty well surmise what's going on pretty much all of the time. But the people I find who really kind of celebrate his work are they either kind of come from highbrow lit, or they come from very much blue collar, dusty knuckles, people who have who have lived lives. And I think that he does such a beautiful job in The Room, where he does these flashbacks to his childhood and to these childhood humiliations, and in all these ways that he feels like he's been perpetually wronged, and let down, and how those disappointments, how they led to this really intensive anger, and he'll take a lot of these memories and run with them, as they, and act like he zigged when he should have zagged. He'll act like he took a different course of action and that it wound up differently. There's a scene where he's talking about the trial, and he's talking from the perspective of the lawyer defending himself. He's acting as as like chief counsel, and he's like recounting the night of his arrest, and and like he's wowing everyone, and he's showing that that he really was innocent, and that like he really was he really is this this great person. And then there's there's this other scene where he's remembering being in church and seeing this young woman in front of him, and he has this like very intense sex fantasy about this young woman in church, which I I grew up Catholic. I'm a semi-practicing Catholic, but I know what it feels like to feel like a certain subject, a certain location is so sacred, and like you're just gonna fuck it up, and even you feel like the church has let you down, you feel like women have let you down, you feel like society has let you down, and so you engage in this this truly taboo activity in your mind, and he lets that play out, and it's a very it's a very unnerving scene, but at the same time I get that, and it kind of comes with this this feeling of impotence towards the governing body of the church, towards God, towards towards romantic relations, everything. I feel like Selby really understood and was willing to talk about these things that go on in a lot of broken people's minds, but not speaking to them as broken as a matter of condemnation, but broken as you are a sick and suffering person, and I am a sick and suffering person, and you are not alone.
Yeah, that scene, I mean, that actually kind of combines all of this stuff. It hits that kind of fever pitch that's associated with a lot of these things, then it maps it onto, the fever pitch of kind of religious fervor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this, like you said, it's a sexual fantasy that's on the page. It's spliced in between sections of the Lord's Prayer. And so I didn't grow up Catholic, but I grew up Lutheran, right? So I have all of that stuff super memorized.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so I was just very, just very impacted by the juxtaposition between these two things that are, they're not the same. It's funny, we actually, previous podcasts, we talked about Steinbeck, and Steinbeck has a line about, he's talking about whorehouses and church and how they're basically going off of the same emotion.
Yes.
Right? And so there's sort of that concept just directly on the page, and you're reading it, and on one hand it's graphic. It's you can see why Selby Jr. had to go through obscenity trials in the 60s and stuff like this, because he was going in those directions. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's such a humanity to it that you mentioned, that it's not for show. This isn't shock fiction. It's not doing any of that. It's really getting at kind of a core fundamental truth. And I was thinking about this because a couple days before the podcast, I watched that documentary you referenced, the It'll Be Better Tomorrow. And you see that dichotomy of his readership is split between quote unquote highbrow literary critics like Michael Silverblatt, the bookworm guy, he's in there. And then it's also got Gilbert Sorrentino. But then on the other side, you have your Henry Rollins, you have your Lou Reeds, and people really identifying with it. But referenced in that documentary, and maybe a good way to kind of pull this all together, is the supposed last words that Hubert Selby Jr. wrote. And it's just, he wrote this very short message, and it said, "A list of indignities, birth, death." And can there be a better way to encapsulate basically everything that he was writing about in the first place?
Yeah.
I just love it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, he very much wrote for a purpose. And and it's something that that I identify with. And I think it kind of comes down to, that epiphany that he had on what was going to look like his deathbed. And it is what mark are you going to leave on the world? What's your legacy gonna be? And not in so much of an egoism, but I think a lot of people kind of put their their hopes and dreams and kind of want their legacy to be in their children. And I don't have any kids, and it doesn't look like I'm going to, but who knows? But the thing with him and the way that he wrote is, I feel like he wanted his legacy to be a life of service, and he was always writing to people who were in spiritual, psychological, physical, whatever, but mainly spiritual states of unbecoming, or of total ruin. And he was trying to say that identification is a necessary, powerful thing, and that no one knows what's going to happen at the end of the world. And with great pain can come great healing, and can lead to necessary positive change. And he's basically saying, I understand you. You're not alone. Don't give up. And I find that to be truly inspiring. And I think that that's kind of where I don't mean to compare myself to fucking Hubert Selby Jr. But I find that his willingness to take honesty, and to speak painfully about and truthfully about his emotions and his life and what he knows, very much inspires me to want to do the same thing. And if you're reading if you're reading the shit that I write, and you identify with it, I hope that you feel less alone. And I'm not trying to shock anyone. I'm writing from the perspective of someone who has been through the ringer, emotionally and spiritually, in their life, and has kind of wandered out of that in a better position and in a better place, at least for the moment. And I feel like that's what Selby was always doing. Yeah, his writing, for lack of a better word, can be extreme, but he's just writing about it. I think the extremity kind of just comes with him being honest about just how much these feelings hurt, and when these events happen in real life, how horrible that that truly is. And you can't sugarcoat you can't sugarcoat the human experience for all of its pain and for all of its beauty. You just have to take it head on. And if at the end of the day, and at the end of my life, I can know that I identified with people, and that people identified with me, and that we might have found commonality and felt less alone together, in our sicknesses and in our and in our hopelessness, found hope. I think I could die happy.
Yeah. I mean, I think you put that very beautifully. I think you nailed both what Selby Jr. is trying to do and honestly what the whole reason for making art is in the first place, is trying to make that connection.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that summary. Thank you so much for spending the time this Sunday morning chatting. It occurred to me that this is actually probably my new version of church, talking about
Lovely.
books.
That's great.
So it has been a total pleasure, and I just thank you so much for this.
Oh man, thank you so much for having me. This has been truly wonderful. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be involved. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more about Uniform at, and this is my favorite, unifuckingform.com. That's unifuckingform.com. Shame is available today from Sacred Bones Records, and I highly recommend grabbing some Hubert Selby Jr., whether it is Last Exit to Brooklyn, Requiem for a Dream, or The Room, to pair with listening to Uniform. And if you've done all that, you can find out more about us at booksofsomesubstance.com and on Twitter and Instagram with the handles BooksOSubstance. Liking things, subscribing to things, reviewing things, all of these interactions help us try to play the game of the algorithms of our corporate overlords. So we appreciate all that too. Until next time, happy reading.